English translation. 610th contact Saturday, the 24th of January 2015, 13:58 hours.
Nice that you can still come here after the correction work, because I would like to give you this article from Occam to read.
My time today is somewhat limited, but I'm interested in what Occam wrote. So let me read the whole thing.
Everyone against everyone in the name of religions. About the true, long-term causes of terror, the misunderstood nature of freedom, and the power of universal law.
Cause and effect. Many human beings, including many rulers, politicians, and those responsible in all areas, behave like quarreling infants, pubescents, and adolescents who they truly still are in their consciousness, who endlessly provoke each other out of self-opinionatedness. Delusions of grandeur, intolerance, greed for power, belligerence, and human immaturity. It goes back and forth until one of the squabblers raises his fist against the other and beats him with a bloody nose. Whereupon the beaten man, who himself has been pestering him for it, with his constant teasing, runs to mommy and daddy and complains, "The evil man has beaten me. I myself was dear all the time and did nothing bad. Why did he do this to me?" Mommy and daddy immediately, and without asking about the beginnings of the conflict, stand behind what they consider to be the completely innocent and regrettable attack. The so-called victim, and at the same time brand the attacker, who at some point went berserk because he was provoked to death, as the ultimate spawn of evil. And mommy and daddy in this parable a synonym for the public, the short-sighted media representatives and all self-righteous moral apostles immediately organize demonstrations, gather the masses around them and shout out their solidarity with the alleged victim all over the world with posters in their hands. For as is unfortunately customary in this world, far too often only the symptoms of an action are considered and, disregarding the true reasons for this, judged according to truth, distorting, hostile to life and unreal cult-religious values and criteria. This is unfortunately only too well known in the example of the worldwide overpopulation. The long-term, historically developed and deep psychological development of hatred, aggression, war, bloodshed, brute force, and other countless human degradations is deliberately ignored by the majority of people. It is much easier and compatible with the stalled bad conscience, at least for a short time, to identify only the very last link in the chain of causality, namely the effect or symptom, bloody nose, as well as only the performing hand of an atrocity as solely responsible for all unexpected crimes. Attacks, assassinations, degenerations, cruelties, and unspeakable inhumanities. The broad mass of the public, as well as the representatives of the specialized sects, violence and blood press Bild, Zeitung und Konsorten, are sensationally affected and graze in a stupid self-righteousness, presumption and arrogance towards the true causes, with which in turn the circulation figures can be driven to undreamt-of heights. What luck for the purse of opinion makers, publishers and newspaper moguls. We have again shown them who the good guys are, namely the West as the guardian of democracy. Freedom and peace. This is the tenor of self-congratulation, after demonstrations, vigils, and marches against terror and rampant gewalt that are effective in the media but ineffective in nothing. Unfortunately, most human beings lack a coherent way of thinking and the understanding of great connections as well as of causal events, which may have disappeared into the past for a long time, but which still have enormous effects up to the present time. These mechanisms of action, valid over centuries and millennia, in the form of long-forgotten facts, events, and things of the past, are criminally hidden from consciousness. In reality and truth, however, they are permanently latent and continue to exist in their power, remain alive in memory and conscience, and continue to have an effect on the current life of the human community. This means that all thoughts, feelings, deeds, actions, and other things, as causal forces, always exert an influence on people's lives until they are completely exhausted with regard to their power. As long as the person recognizes them in his inner being through profound rethinking, what he is practicing true repentance, forgiveness, and reparation, and thus atonists the guilt that has arisen. The guilt, including the causal force of evil, is thus dissolved into its components and neutralized once and for all, so that it can no longer have any evil consequences. So there is no solution out of sight and out of mind. Even causes, events, forces, vibrations, impulses, and deeds that go back many centuries can, through their subliminal interaction, build up into tremendous powers that seemingly influence today's world events out of nowhere and are able to determine them positively or negatively. Man as an individual and in his totality is always the causer of his fate, whether he wants to admit it or not. Therefore, he should finally learn to bear full responsibility for it, and to seek and find the guilt for the evils he himself caused in the places and times where he himself was the causal force and still is today. The laws of nature, in particular the causality principle of cause and effect, can never be deceived or annulled, for all the stupid wishes, self-deceptions, excuses, and purely symptom-fighting measures of human beings in this regard are only weak-minded and ill-advised attempts at Sisyphus, which are condemned from the outset to miserable failure. The power of the law, which is identical with the power of the creation universal consciousness, and thus the laws of nature created by it, is all-time and irrevocably effective and cannot be influenced in any way by any human illogical force. Whoever opposes it senselessly and purposelessly conjures up his own downfall with absolute certainty and inevitability, regardless of whether he is aware of it or not. A person or a humanity or society that has not really understood the principle of causality and does not want to take full responsibility for all its actions is in reality unfree and thinks it is living only in freedom and peace. In truth, she is blinded, unaware, and blind to the omnipotent laws of the universe, which apply everywhere within and without. This also applies to the inflammatory Pejida movement, patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident, which, under the guise of freedom, homeland protection, and patriotism, plays criminal and stupidly with fire and stirs up xenophobia, racial hatred, and primitive prejudices, as Adolf Hitler and his unscrupulous followers once did in the run-up to the Millennial Kingdom. In his boundless stupidity, Pejida boss Lutz Bachmann revealed himself through a photo on the internet, on which he can be seen as Adolf Hitler. On Facebook, he is also said to have described refugees as livestock. According to a report in the Swiss newspaper 20 Minuten, on 20th of January 2015, in an exchange of words, he described refugees as Gelumper, Dreckspack, and Viehzeug. This speaks a clear language and should lead to such organizations being recognized as inhuman, inflammatory, and fascist. Instead, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has this Nazi troop continue to pour uninhibitedly oil into the fire of hatred and promises to be generous in her attempt to guarantee freedom of assembly at all costs. Annotation. On 21st of January 2015, Bachmann resigned from his functions at Pejida due to the picture and his remarks. The early causes of today's terror. All that has been said so far also applies with infallible effectiveness to the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo, which is only the last link in a chain of provocations whose origins can be found in the events of the last 2 millennia. Wars of cultures, religions, and peoples do not arise from a non-existent coincidence or from nothing, but are the end product of human confusion, injustice, and shamefulness, which until today have not been resolved, forgiven, and thus not erased from the world of causes. How Christianity could become a bloodthirsty world power, threatening to devour everything. How the terrorist organizations Islamic State and Al-Qaeda could become it today. 312 to 2012, 1,700 years of battle at the Milvian Bridge. Church celebrates the Holy Emperor, Emperor Constantine, the gravedigger of free Christianity, the Constantinian turn, the merging of Mithras, cult and Christianity to Catholicism, the tradition, bloodbath after conversion to Christianity. Constantine was born on the 27th of February between 270 and 288 and died on the 22nd of May 337. It is undisputed that on the 29th of October 312, about 1,700 years ago, at the Milvian Bridge in Rome, the northern main entrance over the Tiber, a battle took place in which 2 Roman emperors fought against each other with their armies. The Roman Empire was divided into 4 parts according to the reforms of the Emperor Diocletian, and at the Milvian Bridge at the gates of Rome, the 2 rulers of the Western Roman Empire fought against each other. Maxentius, who had entrenched himself in Rome, and Constantine, who had marched from Gaul, now France. There were countless wounded and dead, and in the end the troops of Constantine won. Maxentius, on the other hand, drowned in the Tiber. This battle would probably no longer interest anyone today except a few experts in ancient historiography. If Constantine, the victor, were not regarded today as the emperor who is said to have helped Christianity achieve its breakthrough in the Roman Empire. And exactly this fateful battle on 28.10. 312 is supposed to have been the triggering moment for it, because only a few hours before the massacre, according to legend, the General Constantine is said to have converted to Christianity on the basis of a vision. Churches celebrate the rise of the Saint Constantine to a bloodthirsty dictator, and they worship him. The theme of Constantine in particular is an obvious example of the fact that history is not something unambiguous, that stands up to all questions and that has been researched as far as possible. But that history basically consists of stories that are told, that are passed on, and as a rule by the winners, who naturally want to achieve a specific purpose. But that doesn't mean that all these stories are true, on the contrary. On the occasion of the anniversary of Constantine, reference is made to certain events from antiquity. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 was a cruel slaughter, and is therefore not so much in the foreground of the celebrations. Rather, the Church celebrates Constantine's rise to sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire, which began at that time, although he literally walked over corpses, ultimately even over the corpses of his own family members. And in several denominations that call themselves Christian, including the Orthodox, Armenian and Coptic churches, Constantine is still venerated as a saint, even though he was most probably not even officially a Christian, but a follower of the Church. The construction of the first St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, the Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the cathedral in Trier in Germany all went back to him. Constantine therefore also appears in the calendar of saints of the Roman Catholic Church, although he was not officially canonized there, and also in the Protestant name calendar of the Evangelical Church of Germany, EKD, the name Constantine is listed in his honor on the 21st of May, just like in the church calendar of the US American Lutherans. The 21st of May is his commemoration day in the major churches. It is the day of his baptism, one day before his death on Pentecost 337, when he had just planned a new war and a new bloodbath. His mother, Saint Helena, 248 250ths to 330, who was baptized by the church and then allegedly found the remains of the cross of Jesus, is also venerated in all major churches. Source: Journal de Théologie ed. Dieter Potzel, issue no. 66. Kaiser Constantine, the gravedigger of free Christianity, cited after http://www. Theology. D/Kaiser Constantine_Kirche. HTM version of 12.5. 2014. Unfortunately, all this has continued to the present day. Here is only a brief excerpt from the murder balance of the Catholic Church, which claims for itself the realization of Christian charity, but has exercised the exact opposite of it. The historian Karl-Heinz Deschner wrote in 1986, after intensive preoccupation with the history of Christianity, in antiquity, the Middle Ages and modern times, including and especially in the 20th century, I do not know of any organization of the world which is at the same time so long, so continued and so terribly burdened with crimes as the Christian Church, especially the Roman Catholic Church in Die Insledite Kirche, Freiburg, 1986, p. 42 ff. Murder of people of other faiths in one's own country. Inquisition, for centuries, approx. 1 million dead. Murder of people of other faiths in one's own country and abroad. Murder of Jews, many millions dead. Murder of people of other faiths in other countries, especially Muslims. Crusades, many millions dead. Murder of natives of conquered lands, for example Indians. Approx. 100 million dead, the greatest genocide of all time. Murder of enemies of war and their families, countless wars inspired and blessed by the Church, many millions dead. Murder of disabled people, demanded, involved, or tolerated, for example in the Third Reich, thousands of dead. The murder of regime opponents of dictatorships with direct church involvement, for example in Argentina. Murder of ethnic groups within a state, with direct church participation, for example Serbs in Croatia in the 1940s, or Tutsi in Rwanda in the 1990s. Murder of animals, devaluation as soulless beings and release for slaughter. Billions and trillions of deaths. Important excerpts from the FIGU Special Bulletin, number 22 of September 2005. Statements by Billy Edward. Albert Meyer, Billy Edward Albert Meyer, prophet of the modern age and bearer of the spiritual form which revived the Prophet Muhammad at that time. All explanations in detail at FIGU Sonderbulletin Asana. 22. The irrefutable truth about the Prophet Muhammad, the true nature of Islam as counterweight to Catholicism. Islam, in its original core true peace, in contrast to Catholicism. All the falsifications and misinterpretations of Muhammad, Emmanuel and all the old prophets, Muhammad's teachings, words, explanations, guidelines, ordinances, etc., created by the scribes, required that the doctrine of the Spirit be brought again in modern times, this time in such a way that the proclaimer writes down the original teachings by his own pen, so that falsifications are made impossible from the outset. This also requires that the original text, written in a good German language, must always be attached to every foreign language text for translations into foreign languages. In fact, Islam as a religion has nothing to do with terrorist jihadism, nor with anything to do with holy war over confrontation with unbelievers through violence or intellectual persuasion with the aim of converting them to Islam. In small form, it basically means in relation to Muhammad's teaching, effort, diligence, zeal, struggle and striving, but only in relation to the personal development of consciousness and behavior of man. This includes the effort, the diligence, the striving and the struggle in relation to the cultivation of interpersonal relations and effective humanity. Muhammad's teaching in relation to jihad also goes on in great form to the effect that man should work for peace among all people and peoples in peaceful struggle, and thus through honest efforts as well as through diligence, zeal and striving. So jihad has no connection whatsoever to war and terror, as claimed by the radical fundamentalist and fanatical Islamists and crazy leaders. Muhammad actually taught the teaching of the Spirit in every respect, but never war, hatred, lovelessness or terror, etc., because Muhammad did not personally write down his teachings as well as his statements and explanations. As it is claimed, unfortunately many things were falsified from the ground up by the actual author, as was the case even after Muhammad's death, and therefore many things were handed down wrongly. Muhammad was well versed in reading and writing, but already, like Emmanuel and all true prophets before him, he had his chronicler, who had to write down everything, as was the case with Emmanuel Judas Iscarioth, who recorded everything faithfully and unadulterated, whereby already falsifications arose, as also later by the scribes, who falsified both the prophet's statements and those of the disciples when they passed on their history and Emmanuel's teachings. Throughout his life, Muhammad never advocated war or terrorism, and even though wars were waged in his name, he was not the fundamental author of them, even though he was blamed for them then and still is today. Truly, peace in Islam is a fundamental pillar, and in the name of Allah, there is no injustice, no murder, no terrorism, and no suicidal or other assassinations. The relationship of Islam as an effect of aggression is completely different from that of Christianity. For example, where bloody conquests, such as crusades, etc., as well as missionary work in all countries and criminal courts, such as the Inquisition, murdered masses of innocent people, as well as the Jewish invasion of the Promised Land at the time of Moses, drinking with the locals and then killing them when they were drunk. From the book Goblet of the Truth, section 28, sentence 24, "What you sow, you will reap in every way, good or evil, so you cannot invoke your fictitious deities and idols or your neighbors, fellow human beings or your imaginary angels, saints and idolized people in relation to responsibility, for this lies with you alone for all things, for everything that your destiny brings you, as well as for everything that happens in the world, in war and peace, in love and hatred, in the just and the unjust, in freedom and bondage, in harmony and disharmony, as well as in good and all evil." Achim Wolff, Germany.
As usual, the whole thing is well explained, whereby I find that you can also read this article in that special bulletin in which you cite Marianne's article I asked you to write. This article here, like Marianne's, makes undeniable facts clear.
I also thought about it that I would add this article to the next special bulletin, right after the article by Marianne. Bernadette said that it was important to publish Marianne's article in a special bulletin as soon as possible, which is why she and I agreed to do a second February special bulletin, number 86-2.
Since the whole thing that these articles show is very topical in terms of time, a quick publication is absolutely appropriate, so I can only agree with your decision.
So do Bernadette and I. Then something else. Recently, I watched a program on television that referred to cryptosporidiosis, but as usual didn't say much. Can you tell me a little bit more about this cryptosporidiosis? If so, then please do so in a form that is also understandable for me as a layperson.
Unfortunately, today my time is really limited, dear friend, but nevertheless I want to give a short answer to your question, but really only short, because I really need to do a task urgently. It is a diarrheal disease that occurs more frequently, especially in people with cellular immunodeficiency.
Excuse me, cellular immunodeficiency does occur in AIDS, right?
This is true, but the disease can manifest itself in anyone who becomes infected with the Cryptosporidium pathogen. Although this is a rare disease, in certain areas a relatively large number of people are still infected, with the infection occurring worldwide, including epidemics. The infection is transmitted orally through the ingestion of infected food or infected drinking water. But infection is also possible through infected pets and farm animals, as well as from person to person through body fluids. Cryptosporidia are a genus of unicellular parasites that very often infect calves and about 50 other vertebrates, as well as humans. The parasites belong to the so-called Apicomplexa, which are closely related to Plasmodium, the pathogen of malaria, as well as to Toxoplasma gondii, the pathogen of toxoplasmosis. According to my estimates, about 4% of the European population are carriers and excretors of the Cryptosporidia pathogens, without their being aware of it and without themselves falling ill with it. If the person suffers from the disease, then he or she is affected by watery diarrhea in connection with abdominal pain, which is usually associated with mild fever attacks as well as weight loss and dizziness. If the person is otherwise healthy and does not suffer from other diseases, then the disease heals after about a week without consequences. When the healing process takes place, an immunity develops that lasts for the rest of one's life. In infants and immunocompromised persons, such as AIDS, longer and more complicated courses can occur, whereby in people suffering from AIDS, the Cryptosporidia disease is often associated with chronic diarrhea, whereby the disease ultimately also sometimes appears as a cause of death. In otherwise healthy human beings, the infection, that is to say, cryptosporidiosis, usually heals by itself after a few weeks, while the disease is problematic for reptiles, for example, and usually leads to death. If the human being only ingests a few Cryptosporidia pathogens, for example via pets or raw food, then only slight outbreaks can occur. These do not occur at all and cause complete immunization because the low pathogen uptake acts like a protective vaccination. I can explain this briefly because unfortunately my time is really limited today, so I have to leave now and cannot go into this matter any further.
What you have explained is much more than what was shown and said on television. Thank you for your execution. But I will still look in the internet, and if I find something to it, which explains something important, then I copy it and attach it still to our discussion report.
Of course you can do that. If you can find something more detailed on the internet, then you can copy it out and add it to our conversation because I have nothing against it. Then goodbye, Edward, because I really have to go now, and I will be here again by the 3rd of February at the latest. If nothing important comes up and you call me about it, dear friend.
Farewell, Ptah. Thanks and goodbye, dear friend.
Excerpts from the internet source. Medizinfo Cryptosporidiosis pathogen occurs worldwide.
Cryptosporidiosis is a diarrheal disease. The pathogen, Cryptosporidium parvum, is a parasite that occurs worldwide. More than 40 vertebrate species are known as carriers or reservoirs for the pathogens. Cryptosporidia are particularly common in cattle, horses, goats, sheep, but also in dogs, cats, and birds. Ways of transmission. The pathogen is excreted with the feces of the infected animals in the form of so-called oocysts. Oocysts are egg-like reproductive stages of the pathogen. A transmission to humans occurs mostly through contaminated water. This can be drinking water from which, for example, ice cubes were made, or also bath water. Contaminated vegetables and fruit washed with this water, for example, can also be a source of infection, as can meat contaminated with the pathogen. Smear infections in which pathogens pass from animal feces to humans or from one human being to another are possible. Infection: if oocysts are ingested, infectious sporozoites are released in the small intestine. These multiply through reproduction and form oocysts in several development steps, which contain the egg stage of the Cryptosporidia and are excreted. The mostly thick-walled oocysts are excreted with the feces and can remain infectious for up to 2 years. But about 20% of oocysts are thin-walled. They can still burst in the intestine. In this way, a chronic autoinfection develops, especially in immunocompromised people. Incubation time and infection. The incubation period is between 1 and 12 days. Most diseases break out 7 to 10 days after infection. Infectivity begins when the infected person excretes oocysts with the stool. This happens about 5 to 21 days after infection. After the symptoms have subsided, the ability to infect remains intact for several weeks. The symptoms of cryptosporidiosis are particularly severe watery diarrhea. This results in a severe loss of fluid. Those affected often also suffer from abdominal pain, fever, and nausea. Weight loss may occur. Chronic infection: as a rule, the symptoms last 1 to 2 weeks before they disappear on their own. However, cryptosporidiosis can also become chronic in infants and immunocompromised people, especially in AIDS patients. Then the symptoms persist permanently. There are very large losses of fluid and electrolytes, and also of body weight. Depending on how severe the immunodeficiency of the affected person is, cryptosporidiosis can also be fatal. Colonization outside the intestine. As a rule, the symptoms of cryptosporidiosis are limited to an infestation of the intestine. In AIDS patients, however, colonization outside the intestine can also occur. The system of the bile ducts in the liver is most frequently affected. More rarely, pancreas, appendix, or lung are affected. For diagnostic purposes, the excreted oocysts are detected in the patient's stool under the microscope. There are also tests to detect antigens in stool. In an endoscopy, a tissue sample can also provide evidence of the pathogen. Because the excretion of oocysts may vary, 3 different stool samples should be tested. Therapy: cryptosporidiosis is a disease that must be reported under the Infection Protection Act. A specific therapy against the parasite does not yet exist. Therefore, only the symptoms can be treated. The first step here is to balance the liquid and electrolyte. Medication's highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART, has a positive effect on AIDS patients. In addition, the Robert Koch Institute writes, nitazoxanide, a broad-spectrum antibiotic with antiparasitic activity that is currently only approved in the USA for the treatment of cryptosporidiosis in children aged 1 to 11 years, leads to clinical improvement. In addition, the administration of paramomycin proved to be partially effective in some studies. Prevention: the oocysts of Cryptosporidia resist all disinfectants. Heating to 60 degrees for at least 30 minutes safely kills the pathogens. Infections and transmissions are avoided by thorough hygiene measures, such as regular hand washing after using the toilet or contact with diapers, etc., and before every preparation of food. Infected persons are not allowed to visit swimming pools, saunas, etc. Next contact report.